The US seems to have a new favorite weapon: sanctions. On Wednesday, the Trump administration unleashed a fresh round of penalties against Russia. The US believes Moscow is responsible for a Novichok nerve agent attack in the UK on former Russian double agent Sergei Skripal earlier this year. If true, the use of chemical weapons would be a violation of international law. Russia has repeatedly denied the charge.
Vladimir Putin must know that we will not tolerate his deadly acts or his ongoing attacks on our democratic process.
Russia has condemned the sanctions as illegal and promised to retaliate.
The Russian side has warned on numerous occasions that the policy of force and ultimatums is worthless and counterproductive. The Russian side will start to work on retaliatory measures to unfriendly moves made by Washington.
Its economy is still reeling from international sanctions imposed on Moscow in 2014 over its actions in Ukraine. There was a crash in oil prices the same year. Earlier this year, the US Treasury imposed sanctions against 19 Russian citizens and 5 entities for allegedly interfering in the 2016 US elections, the toughest measures Washington has undertaken against Moscow since Trump took office. But the latest measures, which are expected to go into effect later this month, could be even tougher. They come in 2 rounds, with the first one possibly cutting off trade worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They cover US exports of national security-related goods. The second round of sanctions will be imposed if Russia doesn't meet certain conditions, such as ensuring it will no longer use chemical weapons. The sanctions could even ban Russian airlines from using US airports and end nearly all trade between the 2 countries. The ruble has crashed to its lowest point in almost 2 years, and concerns about further penalties have sparked a wider asset sell-off on Russian markets. While the government is confident it will maintain financial stability, Russians are worried.
The effect of the sanctions on Russians is not exactly positive. The euro and US dollar exchange rates are getting stronger, which means that going abroad and buying food will be more expensive.
While Trump is waging economic warfare to reach his foreign policy goals, it's unlikely that the sanctions will drive policy change in Russia. Mobin Nasir, TRT World.
Let's get more on this now with TRT World's editor-at-large Craig Peters, who's in Paris. But first, let's talk to Timothy Ash in London. He's a senior sovereign strategist at BlueBay Asset Management. He specialises in emerging markets. Tim, let me start with you, and welcome to you both to Money Talks. Tim, what is your asset allocation towards Russia at the moment? Are you underweight, overweight, neutral?
Well, we're pretty defensive at the moment. I mean, we've been that way most of the year because we were worried since the April 6th designations. I mean, that was a clear signal of the direction of travel in terms of US, Western relationships with Russia. And we thought more sanctions were likely on the way. And I think, this is what's been proven the case, I think, with the announcement from yesterday. I mean, the trend in terms of the relationship is clearly in one direction. And we think, more sanctions are likely.
So the sanctions, there have been Western sanctions against Russia in place for the best part of 4 years now. The economy has been weakened, but it hasn't collapsed. Are these latest sanctions likely to tip it over the edge into a recession?
Well, they're certainly unhelpful. I mean, as you mentioned, in 2014, they had a marked impact on the economic performance that year, pushed the ruble lower. But I think, remember, I don't think the objective of sanctions way back in 2014 was to actually crash the Russian economy. I mean, they were aimed at changing behaviour or signalling to Moscow that more could come if they didn't change that behaviour. I mean, I noticed in your introduction you mentioned that they haven't really changed Russian behaviour. I think in terms of the Ukrainian context, I think they have. I think, we could have seen a much more serious clash in 2014 after Russia annexed Crimea. There was this intervention in Donbass. Russia held back from a much more serious intervention in eastern Ukraine, I think because they were very surprised in April, May 2014 that sanctions were imposed. I mean, they're one thing in Russia's calculation in terms of how it manages the relationship with Russia, and it's the near abroad, essentially.
From your anecdotal evidence on the ground, how has it changed the way ordinary people and ordinary investors and ordinary business people do things?
Well, I mean, it's made life very difficult for Russian oligarchs. I mean, we've seen some quite significant actions in the UK recently of oligarchs deciding, they're no longer particularly welcome in the UK, and they're selling assets and moving somewhere else. They're not really bringing the money home, which is interesting. If you look at the balance of payments data in Russia, there's no evidence that those oligarchs are kind of investing back in Russia. I mean, they're tending to put it in other offshore locations that seems to be beyond both the Russian authorities and probably they think the American authorities. The Russian economy has really been stagnating since 2012, 2013 as a reflection of low oil prices. I think as a reflection of really the lack of structural reform in Russia at the micro level. The business environment is still very poor. It's not a very open country to foreign investments. Corruption, red tape, bureaucracy, all those things that hamper both domestic and foreign investment are still there. And then there's the difficult geopolitical setting. I mean, there's not only the direct impact of sanctions on trade, there's a really important impact in terms of perceptions of Russia and willingness of big foreign companies to invest long-term in the country. And that's definitely dropped off. The bottom line is that the long-term growth story in Russia is very challenging. Weak growth, weak recovery, and sanctions make a difficult scenario even that more difficult for them.
Right. It's going to be very interesting to see where that money does go. I wonder if Panama Papers 2.0 will shed some light on that, perhaps a few years down the road. Craig, let me turn it to you. Let's get the US perspective on all of this. Tim raised the issue of the end goal. What is the US's end goal in this?
Well, the end goal is that sanctions have been historically a weak tool of diplomacy and have a poor record of actually driving policy change. Trump has changed that. He has said in his tweets and also publicly that he wants world peace. And the way he is going after world peace is to launch essentially ICBMs armed with hyperinflationary warheads at 3 targets: Russia, China, and Turkey. It's very clear that as far as Russian investment, it's a ruble without a cause. And Trump is also using military terminology to describe this. He talks about sanction enforcement. Well, the term sanction enforcement is out of the Department of Defense military textbook. Sanction enforcement in military terms is the coercive measures to control the movement of designated items into and out of a nation or specific area. And this is the first time we've heard a U.S. president parse economic enforcement in military terms.
Yeah. Craig, just looking at the timeline of these sanctions, August 22 is when the first set of sanctions that have been proposed are due to kick in. And then there's a second phase which could potentially come in after that, which is being sponsored by Congress, by Senate. Is all of this a done deal, do we think, at this point? Is there broad bipartisan support for this, and is Trump on board?
Well, absolutely. I mean, Trump is playing the kind of Putin's friend in all this, while the U.S. Congress and the Trump secretaries in the Trump administration want to take Russia apart. I am told that this is a game that's being played. It is a very serious military game.
Right. Tim, let me bring it back to you. Tim, you also cover Turkey, and the currency, as we know, has been falling over here. Last I looked, it's trading around 5.55 to the US dollar at the moment. You blink and it moves another percentage point every time you look at it. Look, the government is expected to roll out a set of measures to counter this massive fall. The new finance minister, Berat Albayrak, today lowered the growth forecast. Is this going to help bring inflation under control?
Well, look, Turkey faces a hugely challenging story now. It started off as a balance of payments crisis. Economists like me were telling the Turkish authorities they need to adjust, they needed to tighten monetary and fiscal policy. They were way behind the curve. They reacted too late, too little too late. And now they had to jack up interest rates very aggressively. And unfortunately, they lack any credibility now. So the central bank should have hiked rates on July 24th. They failed to. It's 2-3 weeks later. Al-Barak is coming up with a fiscal program. Looking at the kind of suggestions made today in terms of what it's made up of, it looks okay, right? It's kind of doing the right kind of things. It's tightening the fiscal position, reducing the budget deficit this year to below 2% of GDP, reducing the domestic debt rollover ratios. That's all great, but it should have been done a couple of weeks ago. And I think the fundamental problem now is a lack of credibility in terms of Turkey's economic policy elite.
Right.
And they need to really get ahead of the curve and be very proactive and talk to the market. They may need to hike rates again. They may need to go to the IMF, but it's a very difficult situation for them now.
It is going to be difficult. Craig, a very quick response from you before we have to wrap up.
Turkey's economic future, in large part, is going to hinge on the next round of ratings given to the country's foreign debt and bonds by Moody's, Fitch, and S&P, scheduled for the next few months. Turkey needs their ratings to be upped from where they are right now, which is a junk. That is the key indicator going forward.
Okay, I'm afraid we are going to have to leave it there. Timothy Ash of BlueBay Asset Management and Craig Copetas in Paris, thank you both very much indeed.